On the other hand, FaceTime with our loved ones, it doesn't just protect us against toxic rumination. It also directly puts the brakes on the brain's stress response. And the benefits can range from lower anxiety to better quality sleep to, yes, better memory. Now, whenever we hear the term chemical imbalance, most of us, I think, reflexively assume medication must be the answer. And yet, the relevant neuroscience leads us to a somewhat different conclusion. There are many different ways of changing neurochemistry. Most of them have nothing to do with medication. It's why I believe in the long run, the most effective way of balancing neurochemistry is to balance our lives. Remember, experience changes the brain. Thank you.
Yeah, you heard it. Experience changes the brain. It does. Brain structures, brain neural networks change. It's used to be thought that what you had was what you had, and you're going to live with that and deal with it and fuck you. But now they're seeing, okay, there's some the brain's pretty resourceful. The thing about the brain is it's always trying to keep you alive. I was thinking about football earlier, and I was thinking about the impact you have when you hit somebody in football, and it's pretty powerful, actually. The brain was never designed for that. The brain's about the consistency of a butter at room temperature. When you put it inside this big hulking box, and then you bang it around and you have 30-mile-an-hour collisions. And over and over and over. And I'm telling you that does damage. And I calculated at one time that the average high school football player that played for 4 years had at least 4,000 hits, which are at the very least miniature jostling of the brain. And at some of the big ones, man, I was in practice one day, me and a friend named JW. We were doing this drill where you get up, you're 10 yards apart, and you run into each other as fast as you can. And there was a huge thump. And Coach Fires said, I don't think I've heard one like that before. How many of y'all want to hear that one again? And everybody say, hey, we'll hear it again. So we got back you have to lay on the ground, and you're on your back. And then he blows the whistle, and you got to get up real quick on your feet and then run at each other and thump. So we did it again. And I know that damage was done during those 2 hits. I know it. And I didn't have headaches or anything, and I didn't have any problem. I kept going with the practice. That was no problem. But you can't do that to a pile of butter and not move shit around. And this particular pile of butter we're talking about has the most important thing to your life in it. Very complex and delicate neural networks. Various parts of the brain that do different things that keep you alive. Say nothing of thought or depression. Boxers, man. Look at anybody who's been in a high-impact sport that involves the head. You're going to see a difference in them compared to their average peer, their average counterpart. Definitely. And as we look further and further into that, I think we're going to see probably some drastic measures going on with sports like football and boxing. I'm afraid it's eventually just going to be seen as, suicide. You're watching suicide right in front of you. And it's just a matter of time after these guys finish a couple years of football or boxing. So that's a shame. But I don't know how you can protect the brain any more than we do. Better padding, bigger. I mean, eventually the helmets will be the size of a house. You'll be in those, I don't know, whatever. Memory is another thing that's affected, obviously. Now, there's a guy on YouTube that I like. He does these little summary videos, these little isolated kind of descriptions of big topics, and he's pretty smart. I think he's a scientist of some kind. He seems like a teacher. The only thing I don't like about him, we have our little quirks. One of my little quirks is I don't like it when people talk like Carl Sagan. I don't know why. I just think that should be left all to Carl Sagan. Yes, he's gone. Don't mess with Carl Sagan. Don't try to sound like Carl Sagan. You can sound like Ronald Reagan, and he's gone. I'm cool with that. Well, you shouldn't have done it. But not Carl Sagan. That's his ball. You can't mess with his ball. Leave that where it is on his memorial tombstone. Yeah, well, this guy tries to sound like Carl Sagan. But what he says is remarkably useful, deep, and relevant. So let's get to it.
Aaron Ralston was out climbing in Utah's Blue John Canyon when a giant rock shifted under his feet and he fell, pinning his right arm to the canyon wall. He was stuck. And worse, he hadn't told anyone where he was going. For the next 5 days, Ralston tried to move and chip away at the rock. He ate his remaining food, drank the last of his water. Eventually, he drank his own urine and started videotaping his goodbyes. But then something happened. Ralston had a dream. He saw himself as a father picking up his son, and with that vision, an overpowering will to survive kicked in. He broke his arm bones, sawed through his flesh with a dull pocket knife, and freed himself. Ralston harnessed some of our most powerful psychological forces: hunger, thirst, desire to be part of a family, need to return to the human community. They ignited his tenacity, which allowed him to do an incredible thing. He harnessed the power of motivation, obviously in a big way. In its most basic sense, motivation is the need or desire to do something, whether that need is biological, social, or emotional, and whether that something is making dinner, going to college, or cutting off your arm. Motivation is what gets you moving. But the big question is, why? Why do we do anything? I mean, why ever bother changing out of my sweatpants? Psychologists often view motivation in one or more of 4 ways. On their own, none of these theories is perfect, but taken together, they help us understand what drives us. Let's start with the first theory, an evolutionary perspective. For a while, in the early 20th century, it was popular to think of all behaviors as instincts, or innate drives to act a certain way. But this so-called instinct theory was misguided, in part because the presence of a tendency doesn't always mean it's supposed to be there. Like, we can imagine why a bunch of people might start rioting at a heated soccer match, but to say that they're supposed to, a little short-sighted. Evolution is a far more complex, chaotic, and interesting process than that. Plenty of behaviors could just be accidents of evolution. Late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould called these accidents spandrels, or traits that rather than being adaptive, just stuck around as byproducts of other processes. Today, we define instincts as complex, unlearned behaviors that have a fixed pattern throughout a species. For example, dogs instinctively shake their fur when wet, salmon return to the stream in which they hatched, and human babies know how to suckle just minutes after being born. These are true genetically predisposed instincts that do not require learning. But today we understand that while certain tendencies may be genetic, individual experience plays a major role in behavior and motivation as well. So another theory of motivation suggests that a psychological need or drive simply compels us to reduce that need. This is called the drive reduction theory. This could be as simple as hearing my stomach growl and looking for a burrito. My need is food, my drive is hunger, my drive reduction behavior is burrito. Drive reduction is all about maintaining your body's homeostasis, the balance of its physiological systems. As much as we're pushed to reduce our drives, we're also pulled along by incentives, the positive or negative stimuli that either entice or repel us. The mouth-watering smell of that burrito pulls me toward it just as much as my hunger pushes me there. However, we're also clearly more complicated than our homeostatic systems, and drive reduction theory may oversimplify a lot of our behavior. For example, a person may fast for days, ignoring their body's hunger to honor some spiritual or political cause, and I know I'm not the only one who sometimes eats when I'm not actually hungry. So a third theory, the theory of optimal arousal, attempts to fill in some of those gaps. It suggests, rather than just reducing a drive or tension like hunger, we're motivated to maintain a balance between stimulation and relaxation. Say you're holed up in your house all weekend studying, you're bored and lonely and getting weird, so you call up some friends to go mountain biking or go to a karaoke bar or whatever you like to do for stimulation. The idea here is that you want to hit the right level of arousal, which, take note, psychologists often use in a non-sexual sense, without getting overstimulated and stressed. So if you nearly break your face on that bike ride or the journey covers at karaoke night start getting too dense, you may need to back off and take a nap. Of course, everyone has a different level of optimal arousal, and I'm guessing Aaron Ralston's was fairly high. Adrenaline junkies may jump out of planes to hit their ideal level, whereas others might be satiated by an engaging book or a new knitting pattern. No matter which, the optimal arousal theory suggests that we're motivated to avoid both boredom and stress. And obviously, not all needs are created equally. If I'm suffocating and can't catch a breath, I'm not going to be thinking about eating that burrito, and if I'm about to be ravaged by lions, I'm not going to be worrying about my next paycheck. American psychologist Abraham Maslow illustrated this shuffling of priorities in the mid-1900s with his famous hierarchy of needs. Down at the bottom of the pyramid, you'll find our most basic physiological needs for food, water, air, and moderate temperatures. The next rung up speaks to our need for safety, then comes love and belonging, followed by esteem or respect. And finally, once all those needs have been met, we have the relative luxury of being motivated by self-actualization and spiritual growth and yoga retreats and stuff. Of course, there are problems with Maslow's vision. Empirical research hasn't really supported his hierarchy. We tend to skip around on that pyramid all the time, and the importance of those higher level needs may vary depending on our culture and finances and personalities. But still, everyone is restricted by the lowest levels of the pyramid, so regardless of theories about why we have them, most schools of psychological thought agree that we are driven by at least 3 big motivators: sex, hunger, and the need to belong. We'll do a whole lesson later on all sorts of sex-related stuff, including how it motivates us. There's a lot there. For now, let's just say that sexual motivation is how we promote the survival of our species through recreation and/or procreation, both of which help human communities bond and expand. Without it, none of us would be here today, thinking about burritos and severed arms and sex and stuff. Internally, we are biologically driven to knock boots by our sex hormones. We're also motivated by psychological and socio-cultural influences ranging from suggestive external stimuli plastered all over billboards, magazines, and TVs in the form of, like scantily clad bodies sprawled out on beaches, to more genteel desires like love and family or adherence to personal, religious, and cultural values. Sex is a big motivator, but it isn't precisely a need. No matter what anyone has told you, people do not die without it. Hunger, though. After air and water, food is our body's greatest need, and thus obtaining food is one of our greatest motivations. Hunger may seem pretty simple: eat food, stay alive, but physiologically and psychologically there is a lot going on, and like so many things, it starts in the brain. The sensation of hunger usually begins with a drop in your blood sugar level. Glucose is our body's primary source of energy, and while you might not initially feel a drop, your brain will. Your hypothalamus monitors your blood chemistry and responds to both high levels of the hunger hormone ghrelin and low levels of glucose by triggering that feeling of hunger, reminding you to eat something. I am in fact experiencing it right now. Once you've eaten that burrito, your metabolism takes over, converting that food into energy. But while our physiological need for calories varies depending on our body size and composition, your gender, and your age, our hunger is also shaped by our psychology, culture, and mood. And these factors don't just rule when we're hungry, they also guide what we're hungry for. Biologically speaking, most humans and many other animals have a genetic taste for sweets and fatty foods because they're typically high in energy, but other taste preferences are conditioned through experience and culture. I may have an aversion to oysters because they once made me sick, and love gingerbread cookies because my grandma used to make them. Although popular in Cambodia, I'm not too keen on eating fried tarantulas, just as lots of folks around the world think that the very idea of peanut butter is gross. Still, the feeling of hunger affects us the same. During World War II in the US, some conscientious objectors volunteered for medical research as an alternative way to serve their country. Perhaps the most famous of these studies was physiologist Ansel Keys' Minnesota hunger experiment, which measured the effects of semi-starvation by partially starving its volunteers. While ethically dubious, the experiment was geared toward understanding the many small and large effects of hunger which was plaguing Europe at the time. The study started in 1944 by feeding 36 young, healthy men a normal diet for 3 months, then halving their caloric intake for 6 months, then slowly rehabilitating them to normal weight during the last 3 months. They ate mostly wartime foods like root vegetables, bread, and pastas, and were required to walk 22 miles and participate in various work and educational activities for 40 hours each week. The goal was to see a 25% drop in body weight during the starvation period. And as you can imagine, the changes were dramatic. The men became gaunt and listless and showed a decrease in strength, heart rate, and body temperature. But the psychological effects were perhaps even more dramatic. The men became totally obsessed with food. They dreamed about it, talked about it all the time, read cookbooks. They lost interest in sex and jokes and social activities. They were irritable, anxious, and depressed. In the end, they were all rehabilitated, but the study gave us some understanding of the devastating psychological effects of starvation. It also showed us something of the social effects as men withdrew from one another and isolated themselves. As one fundamental need was frustrated, these men experienced the decline of another, the need to belong. Humans are social animals. Evolutionarily speaking, it's fair to say that social bonding has helped us survive. It's a tough world out there, and we've got a lot better shot at thriving if we're sharing resources and responsibilities, protecting and supporting each other in groups. That isn't to say you need to be joined at the hip with everyone. Our social needs have to be balanced with our autonomy, our sense of personal control, so we feel both connected and independent. But sometimes we're denied that sense of belonging. belonging. We've all experienced the pain of being ignored or rejected at some point in our lives. It's worse than just about anything. The evidence for this is abundant. One recent study suggested that teenagers who had a sense of belonging to their community had better health and emotional outcomes than those who didn't feel like they belonged.